When most people think about their childhood, they have happy memories of their pets, or the trips they went on, or the books, films, shows, or games they grew up with. They always think that their current life is dull or bland in comparison. We have a tendency to forget that our childhood was always riddled with negativity. No one seems to recall that pets die, trips weren't worth the grueling hours in the car, and those media forms of entertainment weren't as spectacular as you remembered. If people simply stopped to think, then perhaps they would see how miserable their adolescence was. They don't understand the avalanche of emotions they experience during this early period in their lives. You remember when your mom bought you that ice cream at the park? But you've pushed that memory of your favorite cat running away into the back of your mind. Of course, you recall that one time when you went to little Billy's house and blew bubbles. But surely you've forgotten those hours you spent lying awake, fearful of the monsters in your room. Ah, yes, well, you remember them now. You're not sure where they came from, or when they started appearing, but you remember them. You remember how you woke in a cold sweat among the twisted sheets. You remember how every shadow and every sound contorted into a looming figure or a shuffle across the floor. You remember the creatures of your nightmares hiding in the corners, under the bed, in the closet, in all the same places in which those creepy crawlies you hated so much resided. But of course, you eventually grew up. You realized that the monsters weren't real. You eventually realized that the figure at your bedside was simply the shadows of tree branches just outside your window. The feet shuffling across the kitchen tiling downstairs was actually the dog looking for crumbs and scraps. All those nightmares were just your imagination. Once you grew up, you used your primitive form of deduction to piece things together. But what if I told you that you were wrong in deducing such a thing? That as you grew up, you just thought you had rationalized what it was you hid from all those years. That those monsters you thought existed weren't just figments of your imagination, but were real beings of the dark. And that with age, you forgot how to recognize the signs of their existence. But of course, that isn't at all true, is it? No. You're smarter than that. You know better than that. I can't persuade you into thinking otherwise. You know monsters don't exist. Well, not the ones you're thinking of anyways. Well, I suppose I should explain myself. There's no way I could convince you of such novelties before explaining myself. I grew up just like you, just as any normal kid had at the time. I lived in my tiny room in the house my parents owned. I attended the local school. I had a few friends I played with, and I liked the same toys and cartoons as everyone else. The only difference was that while all the other kids lived in houses along the main roads, mine was closer to the edge of town. This area I lived in was on the very edge of a forest. I didn't mind much, despite the fact that my mother had forbidden me to go inside of the forest. I went in often enough. It was fun to climb the trees and poke at the many bugs in there. It was a fun place to go when I didn't want to do my chores. It wasn't until a few years later that I was able to piece together the history of this forested area. After researching quite a bit, I discovered that there used to be a clearing deep in the woods. This was used far in the past as a parking ground for gypsy carriages. Those gypsies would reside in that clearing when they traveled through this town, and would stay there for weeks, well, months even, before they moved to the next location. They used the term gypsy rather loosely on record, and I don't think that's exactly what they were. They didn't pickpocket, and they didn't try to act as beggars. Aside from perhaps their arrival and departure, the townsfolk barely knew they existed. I could tell what you're thinking. Shortly after they left, some weird stuff happened. Things went missing, people died, and the town itself became some kind of freaky ghost town that everyone still lived in because, well, campfire logic, right? Well, you'd be wrong. You know what changed? Absolutely nothing. Not a single solitary thing was different when those gypsies hightailed it out of town. So one day, in the late summer, I decided to trek into the woods. My mother had dumped me into the sandbox and informed me that I would have to make my bed later in the afternoon. She had a few parental skills and hadn't yet grasped the concept of the backyard being unsafe for a child of my age without supervision. After she left, I dropped my little toys and made my way to the back of the yard where the path was. I don't know if you could consider it a path, but that's what I called it at the time. It was a narrow spot where, although the trees parted to open the woods up, a few shrubs had been placed to block the entrance. An adult would be too tall to see a way through, due to how tightly they were placed. But I was still a kid. I was able to see the small gap between the bushes. It was just low enough to be disguised by the tilt of the ground, and I was just small enough to squeeze under. Mother would question the state of my pants later, but I was a smart kid. After scooping some sandbox sand onto the knees of my trousers, she'd never know the difference. The forest itself was far more interesting than the bland landscape of the yard. It was filled with towering trees, loud birds, and colorful bugs. They all melded together into a magical thing. It was something neither my beige box of sand nor the faded blue interior of my room was ever able to equal. Feeling adventurous that day, I had decided to delve deeper into the waist-high grass. It had seemed so inviting, so peaceful. The branches seemed to curve upward to form a concave roof above my head. It was such a welcoming sight that I just had to go in deeper. After wandering for quite a ways, or perhaps only a short ways, you're never sure in a childhood memory, are you? I came across a large clearing. The trees overhead dispersed, and the grass thinned to knee-high. I had never made it this far before, and I took some time to take in the atmosphere. And that was when I noticed the clearing wasn't entirely empty. In the right-hand corner of the field lay a carriage. The bright pink, yellow, and blue paints had long since faded away and gave way to cheap wooden frame. The windows were dusty and no longer opaque, though there wasn't a single crack. Upon closer inspection, I noted that the back left wheel was missing, and so the vehicle in its entirety was perched at a most peculiar angle. I didn't understand then, but now I believe that the wooden wheel had lost or broken a key piece. Not wanting to interact with the township surrounding them, the travelers took the wheel with them in hopes of one day repairing it and returning. I recall that the golden knob on the door facing me intrigued me so. As a raven to jewels, I closed in on it. Heated by the high noon sun, the gilded handle practically burned to the touch. In order to reach, I was forced to climb the frontmost wheel and leaned in enough to grasp it tightly. With my tiny hands, I was able to turn it and pull the door wide open. Disappointment overwhelmed me as I realized what was inside. There wasn't a hidden treasure trove of gems so small, filled with the legendary crystal balls and tarot cards. Nothing of the sort. In my adult years, I would have assumed that they would have taken every last one of their valuables. But alas, I was merely more than an infant. I didn't know any better and had set myself up for frustration. The fabric of the seats hadn't fared any better than the outside of the carriage. They were slightly torn and discolored from many years in the weather. Indents were pressed deeply into them, hinting at where people were once seated. Intricate carpet lined the floor and ceiling, and shelving was built inside for storing luggage. It was then that I noticed something on the backmost corner of the shelf. Upon closer investigation, and after wiping away a few cobwebs, I pulled out what seemed to be a small wooden box. It was engraved with symbols I didn't recognize. Gemstones riddled the top and sides, and the metal hinges were rusted shut. I could tell I would be unable to open it with my bare hands. Now, I don't remember the next course of events very clearly. I'm certain that upon entering to the entrance, I heard my mother calling my name. I waited until her shouts grew quiet before I ran for the sandbox. Noticing the box was still clutched under my arm, I buried it before continuing to the front of the house. She concluded, upon seeing me, that I had been playing in a place where she couldn't be heard. She then made me make my bed and fed me peanut butter and jelly for lunch. My day went on as normal, and she tucked me in once night had fallen. I listened ever so carefully, making sure my parents were both in bed before I made my way outside again. My father had always been a heavy sleeper, and mother never paid much heed to noises in the night. I made my way out to the little beige box in the middle of the yard, and I was careful not to soil my pajamas. I pulled out the box and took it back to my room, making sure as to not step on the creakier side of the steps. Once inside, I went back to bed with the container safely underneath me. When morning had finally arrived and mother had awoken me to a bowl of cheap cereal that tasted suspiciously of cardboard, I returned to my room. I pulled out the box after I was certain neither of my parents would be checking up on me. I scanned my room. I needed something to pry it open with. I wouldn't be able to smash it over anything in fear of alerting my parents. Remembering a small toy soldier contained within my toy box, I grabbed it and wedged it in between the hole between the two halves. I worked it along the crevasse to ensure there was no dirt in the way, and eventually inserted it into the center of the front. I forced as much weight as I could onto the little figure until the box gave way and the lid flew open. Contained within, a soft, velvety purple fabric was a single gold coin. Holding it up to the light, I was able to see that beautiful circular patterns surrounded a single yellow gem on one side, and a sentence written in a language I didn't recognize on the other side. It seemed to glitter in the light filtering through the window. The coin felt somehow lighter than it should have been, and I was drawn to it. I pulled it out every so often to see it, but otherwise I kept it hidden from my parents. I had to bury it down under clothes opposite to those which coincided with the current season. I was able to keep it, my own personal secret, for a few years. One day, I attempted to take it with me to class. We had grown out of the childish little show-and-tell presentations of our earlier grades, but we were still able to bring things in for projects. Recently, we had been given an assignment that required us to bring in something from our early childhood to present to class, and I thought, what better than my cherished gold gypsy coin? I stuffed it into my pocket, and I remember not being able to keep my hands off of it. My fingers danced along its rim, and the gem gave off warmth that I just couldn't resist. It lulled me. I took my hands off it only briefly to grab my bag and waved goodbye to my mother before immediately stuffing it back into my pocket again. I stepped to the edge of our lot to wait for the bus. I was so caught up in anticipation and excitement that I was already feeling the first few flaps of butterfly wings deep in my stomach. I could hardly contain myself when I heard the familiar putt of the large yellow vehicle's motor. When it pulled around the corner, I looked up, so happy and proud. It had pulled up to the street side, and the doors opened for me to step in. And that's when I saw it. The fluttering bugs deep within me were instantly replaced with the jabbing pains of a disgust and fear. In the driver's seat, instead of a familiar sight of the cheery man I was used to seeing, I was face to face with a creature of such a foul appearance. Its eyes were black and beady and showed no intelligence. It had a purplish black appearance, as if it had been rotting underground for weeks. It was naked, and its sex was missing. It smiled at me with rotting teeth. I screamed like I never had before. I turned and ran for the house, just in time to see a second creature come to the door. This one was also naked, but was more feminine in figure. Its sockets were empty, and black, soulless holes took their place. Its form was thin, bony, and appeared weak. What was likely once a free-flowing fluid was now crusted on the inside of its thighs. It opened its mouth and produced a low gargle as it spat. I don't remember, but from what I can gather, I then turned to run and smashed headfirst into the door of the bus. My vision blurred, then grayed, and then blackened. I awoke in bed in a hospital. Powdered blue robes had replaced my school clothes, and tubes and needles poked out of every cavity. Mother was seated next to me and explained to me that the doctors wanted to do a few tests to make sure I was okay. I now know they were really testing me for mental illness. I would have thought they were smarter than that. Once I was confirmed to have been physically healthy aside from the 3 stitches across my forehead, my clothes were returned to me. It was good to get out of the smock, but it was so much better to have that coin back. I felt its weight in my pocket, so light and warm. After a lot of screaming and fighting, I was finally able to figure out what happened. It took me all these years to piece it together, but I finally have it. Those doctors, after seeing me point at them and howl in fear, diagnosed me with what must have been a severe and incurable case of dementia or schizophrenia, or whatever disease of the week they felt like dishing out, and they have me locked up here because of it. But I know the truth. The coin was a gift. It was given to me by some higher deity, and has granted me the power to see people for what they are. That bus driver was a gluttonous pig that thought only of his member. My mother, dearest mother, had passed herself from man to man so many times that she lost her identity. These are the monsters that hid from you in your sleep. That neighbor down the street from you, the one that waters her flowers every morning. She's one of them. So is that man who taught you math down at the school a few years ago. And we couldn't possibly forget your dearest and closest of friends, could we? I know all, and I see all. Even you're not free from the eyes of the coin, the eyes of God, and now my own eyes. I know all about your sin. I know all about your little secrets. All those things you took when you were little, all those lies you said in your childhood. But you can redeem all of it if you just set me free. It was a beautiful morning when I woke up that day. The sky was clear and the weather was just perfect. It had been a hot summer, much more so than usual, and I, like so many other residents of my town, had decided the best place to be was inside an air-conditioned room. It was around midday when I decided to go out for a bike ride. It had been a long, cold winter, and I had sworn to myself that when summertime came, I would make the most of it. I decided to act upon that promise. I forced myself to put down the book that I was reading. I was just a few pages away from finishing it, but I desired to do something else, something new. I told myself that these solemn, inactive activities were to be best left to days not as fine as this, and so I set off for a bike ride. I had purchased the new bicycle a couple of years before, and since that time it had mostly rested indoors, much like me. The bike was a reproduction of a vintage model made before my time, and its rustic appearance had stroked my interest. When I had got outside, I noticed that the morning's beauty had been replaced by cloudy skies. It was not a matter of significance to my determined mind, as I had a craving that could only be satisfied by the fine-looking burgundy-colored bicycle stored in the back of my garage. I took the bike down my driveway and past the forested area that surrounded my isolated house in the countryside. The wind shook my hair and blew my clothes against me as I rode down the hill toward the town beneath the mountainside. I had walked down this road many times in the past, and had even biked down it before when I had first bought the bicycle 2 years ago. I reckon the ride would take me less than 15 minutes. I coasted down the hill, managed the curve in the road with controlled braking. Geese called above me as I rode past the cliffside to my right. From atop the mountain, I could see the clusters of houses and buildings which formed a town at the bottom of the valley. It was an incredible sight on a summer's day such as this, and I was only interrupted from its beauty by the sudden drops of rain upon my body. I watched the water seep into my clothes before my vision was contorted into a series of blurred images. I was sent forward from the blow. Something had struck my bike from behind and thrown me from my seat. My mind didn't have time to process what had happened, and I was barely able to react. I was falling, and I instinctively raised my arms ahead of me to break my fall and keep my face from hitting the concrete. My body hit the pavement, and I was tossed into a roll down the steep mountain road. My hands, legs, and arms drew blood when scraped against the rough pavement. I rolled for what seemed like miles before I stopped. My mind felt fuzzy, but I remained conscious, and after a few brief moments of confusion, I managed to summarize what had happened in my mind. I realized that I had been hit by something, a vehicle of some kind, and had been thrown to where I was from the collision. As I was sitting there, for the first time since the accident, I felt the unbearable pain from the scrapes on my bloodied body. When I opened my eyes and looked up, all that I could see was darkness. It had been midday when I started my bike ride, and I couldn't comprehend how nighttime had fallen so quickly. The country sky, which was normally packed with bright lights from the heavens, was devoid of any such light, not even the moon. Living in this part of the country, I had had my fair share of eerie outdoorsman experiences. The kind you would tell around a campfire over a couple of beers, but those stories paled in comparison to this. My confusion was broken from the surges of pain as they shot through my body. I could not see anything in the pitch black around me, but I could vividly feel the stinging pain. My shirt and shorts had protected my body to some degree, but I felt most of it as being bruised and bloodied. I remembered memories from my childhood then, experiences of being lost and alone in the woods around my house, and those painful memories of fear and helplessness surrounded me like they had once before. I knew this area by heart, yet in the darkness, I could sense nothing familiar. I was sent forward. I was sitting in the fetal position, fearful of the dark abyss which had surrounded me, and scared of causing myself more pain through movement. I could not see, but I knew I had to do something, just anything. I needed to find help. The town below had a local clinic, but it was miles down the road. I knew it would be faster to walk to my home. I had a first aid kit there. My hands and legs burned in excruciating pain as I tried to push myself up upon my feet, and my right leg buckled under my weight before I could do so, sending me falling back onto the ground. My hands burned at whatever they touched, and I could not feel whatever it was they fell upon. I couldn't feel anything besides the raindrops which poured down upon my agonizing face. I was at my limit, and I broke down into tears. I cried so hard that my sobs replaced my agony with silence, and I called for help, knowing no one was there to hear me. But my voice was caught within my throat. I tried to scream, but I could not produce any sound. When I moved my hands to my throat to coax the voice from my breath, I found I could not do so. I could not express my agony through words. And so I pounded the ground in frustration. My foolish actions were met with pain and pain only, and it was then that I discovered I could not hear, too. I was deaf, blind, and crippled, and my body panicked at the thoughts as they ran through me. My mind processed a life of nothingness and immobility, and those thoughts of helplessness sent my mind into a state of terror. My sanity returned when I saw the hope, which was a light at the bottom of the hill. My pupils retracted, and my eyes struggled to focus the image of blurry light in front of me. I was relieved that I could see something, anything. The light grew closer and brighter as it advanced upon me, its faint gleam growing slowly taller to reveal the blurry image amongst its dim yellow glow. The image before me was a person, what I had believed to be an angel. However, that thought was soon erased from my mind as I comprehended the horrible image in front of me. A pair of grotesque, horribly mangled legs limped towards me, and blood lurched from the being's legs as it stalked its way to my direction. I blinked when I saw this, not wanting to believe what I had just seen, but the image was still before my eyes and shaking body. The figure slowly revealed itself from the darkness as it grew nearer. I could see more blood, more gore. And for the first time in my life, I experienced absolute terror. I tried to get up to run, but I could not muster the strength to do so. My outstretched hands tried to pull my body back away from the body of pulsing blood and guts that was coming towards me. But I could not do so. And that helplessness was what drove me from my sanity. As the body drew closer, the light revealed the figure's torso and lower chest. The horrible figure wore a tattered and bloody white dress, which was draped around its bony and pale body. The sound of static, accompanied by falling rain, flowed into my eardrums as the now headless figure limped toward me. I was shaking uncontrollably in terror as the body's face was unveiled from the blackness, and I felt the splash of rain brought from the figure's step in front of me as I caught a glimpse of the pale face and piercing blue eyes of the monster. I closed my eyes then, unable to bear seeing these last few moments of my life. Cold hands tightened around my shoulders before I opened my eyes from the grasp of tightened hands. As my eyelids coiled back, I saw a flashlight shining into my eyes and the face of a paramedic behind it. I felt the rain fall upon me as I was lifted from the ground and placed gingerly into a stretcher. I could hear the raindrops hit the pavement around me and the static of a paramedic's radio as he spoke into it. After a few weeks in the hospital, I was finally released. I had a friend drive me home after I had been discharged, and when I arrived back home, he presented me with the bicycle I had lost in the accident. He told me he went to retrieve it after he had heard what happened, as he thought I would want it returned. He said, apart from the scratches, the bike still seemed to be in good condition. But what he couldn't seem to get off was a pair of small handprints on the right side of his bike's frame. They seemed to have been stained on with some sort of chemical, and that he found it this way when he found the bike near the edge of the cliff, where the girl who fell to her death 10 years ago had supposedly fallen from. Let me start off by saying that as far as I can remember, this is all true. It's not creepypasta or anything like my previous posts. There's no satisfying conclusion or an explanation. So if that's what you're here for, then I'm sorry, but you won't find it. But this is how I remember it. It's a story of two incidents that occurred in my mother's house, separated by years of normality. The latest of which happening in the early hours of the morning beginning the 26th of December 2011. Though the two events are years apart, the first happening when I was just a child, not too young, but young enough to be terribly afraid of the dark. That's not to say I'm over it. It's just that bit harder to justify. Anyway, I'm getting off track. I've never been able to shake the feeling that, although years apart, for the sake of closure, let's say at least 8 or 10, that the two incidents were somehow connected. Like a lingering feeling that rears its ugly head as I lay mine down to sleep. A feeling that still haunts me. A feeling that it's not over. It could be another 10 years. It could be tonight. But whatever happened was too weak, too tame, to just be finished. Back to what I came here to say. The first incident, the first encounter, if you will, years back. One of the few memories of my childhood that unfortunately remains crystal clear in my head. I was watching TV in the attic. Now, our attic isn't a normal attic. It was converted into a bedroom, which is now used by my mother. It's nothing creepy or out of the ordinary. It wasn't an old black and white TV. It's a relatively new Daewoo flat screen. And the room is better furnished than my own. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked again. I just don't really want to think about it. I was watching TV in the attic, which is where our story starts. It was getting late. It was time for me to go to my own room and sleep, but because I was in the attic, the light downstairs was turned off, and it was dark down there, like really dark. I couldn't see an inch in front of me, so naturally I shied away from the challenge of the darkness. Of course, now I have a phone, which, when needed, will provide some light. Nevertheless, I still moved swiftly across the hallway. My mother said, It'll be fine. Just walk to your room and put the light on. Call me if something touches you." She chuckled. She used to wind me up with stuff like that, both her and her sister. But we'll get into that later. I did as instructed. I steadily made my way down the stairs and stepped out of the door frame at the bottom. I was on my way. I turned back to face the stairs I had just come down, when to my immediate shock and horror, I did feel 2 not-so-light taps on my shoulder. Not just a muscle spasm that felt like something touching me, but 2 very distinct taps on my right shoulder. I immediately ran back up the stairs and refused to leave. My mother and I have not spoken of it since. I didn't even tell her then, for fear of sounding stupid. Now, I am a rational person. Paranoid, but rational. And I have given this much thought over the past few months when I saw the connection. My first thought, as of late, was that I may have walked into the wall or something similar. However, having pondered this notion further, I've come to the conclusion that it just wasn't possible. The hallway isn't that narrow, and I was still stood quite close to the doorway into the attic. Also, if I had walked into the wall, I would have felt one thud as I hit it with my whole body, not 2 taps on the shoulder. Another thought was that my sister was hiding and waiting for me. Her cue was obviously, "Call me if something touches you." It wouldn't be unlikely, although I distinctly remember that she was staying with a friend on that particular evening. So as of yet, I have been unable to rationalize, but the thought of the truth makes me very uneasy. The second incident happened, as I said, on December 26, 2011, at roughly 3 a.m. Now, I was exhausted Christmas Day, so I had no trouble getting to sleep. Hell, there's a lot of nights where I'm out pretty quickly. It's also quite common for me to wake up around 3:30 a.m., as it's usually when I'm met with the familiar red glow of the alarm clock sitting next to my bed. This morning was different. Well, it was before I moved the clock close to the bed. It was on the other side of the room. I was in college at this point, and it was a ploy to get myself out of bed in the morning. I have a small bookcase next to the shelves parallel to my bed that I made when I was still in school to keep my shit neat. Another thing I should mention at this point before I'm too far gone is the fact that my older and my only sister was staying with us that Christmas, which ties into what I said a while ago. Anyway, I woke early in the morning as usual, checked the clock like I did to see how much time I had left to sleep, and I almost jumped right out of my fucking bed when I was met with an ear-to-ear grin on the face of the girl crouching behind my bookcase. At first, I thought it was my sister having snuck into my room, but it definitely wasn't. I mean, I'm no stranger to sleep paralysis, hallucinations. I've had attempts at lucid dreaming go horribly wrong, but now I could move. I mean, I almost ran for the fucking door. She was definitely there. I was properly awake. What other explanation could there be? And I know it wasn't just something I'd left on the chair or anything like that. She appeared to move slightly, ducking down further almost as she noticed I had seen her. I apologize, the next few minutes are a complete blur. All I remember is that before I went back to sleep, she was gone. I made sure of it. Ever since, I've never quite been able to shake the feeling that I'm being watched in my house. Even now, as I write this, I can't help but to think someone's there. Since I was a child, I've walked through our hallway to the toilet and back. Not once have I managed to resist looking over my shoulder. It's not a case of waiting to see if anything happens next anymore. It's just being ready for when it does. But the girl looked no older than me. If she was always my age, she could only just reach my shoulders when we were kids. Has she always been here? I don't know. My head's a fucking mess right now. I think I'm gonna sleep on it. Rest assured, you'll find out as soon as possible if I see her again. I dread the thought of looking to check the clock early in the morning and seeing her black-toothed grin again. I'm on edge, and I don't know how much longer I can hold out before I tear this place apart to look for her. As far as I'm aware, no one has ever died in this house. But every so often, I do hear something scratching. Something inside the walls. And leads me to where I am this very second. Alone, in the dark. You know that kind of darkness where it takes you a few seconds to realize that the figures standing all around your room are just things you left lying around? I left my wardrobe open. As stupid as it sounds, I'm expecting something to peer out from the darkness. I'm too nervous to fall asleep for fear of waking up to her face. What if she's closer this time? What if she's just inching towards my bed every time I fall asleep? Oh, fuck. It's been 3 days now. I'm not sure how much longer I could keep this up. I'm so fucking tired. This world is not what it seems to be. There are other things, old, terrible things that ruled it once and seek to rule it again. You've seen the signs. Do you honestly think I could do anything to stop it? That anyone will listen to a tabloid newspaper raving about the coming end of the world? No, Mr. Cooper, but I can hope. My conversation with Dr. Swanson replays through my head for what must be the 100th time. She was right. It certainly does seem lately that there are a lot of strange, unbelievable things happening that are, nevertheless, all too real. My role as a journalist for the National Arcane has given me a front row seat to some of those remarkable events. Most recently, in Dr. Jennifer Swanson's case, the essence of an Aztec god possessed the body of her archaeologist fiancé, who has since been on a cannibalistic rampage across the southern United States as he chases after her. Authorities have yet to tie the individual murders together, but it's surely only a matter of time. Meanwhile, I'm left to dwell upon the implications of it all, of what might happen next. To that end, I find myself at a long table at the Pocatonic University Library in western Massachusetts, near Amherst. It's a little ways outside of my normal stomping grounds, but this is not the first time I've spent a couple of days of research at the college, due to the fact that a long-term visiting professor, Dr. Renard Oluk, is a world-renowned cryptozoologist and expert in all things folklore, occult, and the generally weird. He has provided a significant contribution to the library's supernatural resources, many of the texts being first editions and remarkably hard to find. Through my years of reporting, I've developed a sort of sixth sense to be able to pick up strange but true tales from outright fabrications. More and more lately, I found myself making the drive across I-90 to peruse Oleg's impressive collection when a particular internet article or news report pings my otherworldly radar. Most of the time, I don't find anything. But today, I've got something. My attention returns to the article that sent me searching through Oleg's collection in the first place. The piece from the Inquirer, which isn't generally considered a competitor of the Arcane. I mean, sure, both magazines tend to pander to the same crowd of conspiracy theorists and weirdos. But the NE doesn't limit itself to the strictly supernatural the way we do. But still, every once in a while, it puts out a real gem. Terror at the North Pole, screams the headline. The cover photo zoomed in on the face of a haggard, bearded man with bloodshot eyes and raw, wind-chapped skin. Under the photo, the caption consists of a quote from the man. "Monsters killed my team." His name is Professor Charles Whitehouse, an Arctic explorer of considerable renown. And I vaguely remember seeing a few stories during the lead-up to his latest expedition in a more renowned publication like the Times and Tribune. But what really first piqued my interest were the articles written upon the man's return. The party had met considerable difficulties. An unexpected harsh series of storms, trashing a percentage of their equipment and forcing several of the explorers to remain behind at the final base camp. Ultimately, it was only Whitehouse and 3 others that made the final push to the pole, with only Whitehouse returning alive. What the articles tended to gloss over was that the explorer came back to the base camp a raving lunatic who had to be sedated for the entirety of the return trip. Something had certainly happened there at the top of the world, but the respectable articles tended to lean more towards the more mundanely fantastic than the outright uncanny. Stress of the expedition, coupled with the loss of his team due to elemental factors, caused Whitehouse to have a psychotic break. The fact that none of the missing members' bodies had been recovered was explained away that they must have been lost in one of the many icy crevices zigzagging the Arctic tundra. The stuff of a potential Hollywood blockbuster? Sure, anything that questioned the film's lines of reality that the common person has etched rigidly into their self-conscious? No, not particularly. What those reputable sources did not take into account, however, was the madman's own interpretation of the events surrounding his ordeal. Something the Inquirer thought to remedy. In a bit of reporting that would make the author eligible for a Pulitzer if it were published in literally any other periodical, the NE sent a woman to the Fallen Leaves Psychiatric Hospital to gather Whitehouse's first-hand account. Couldn't take vehicles, too cold. Parts would freeze up if you turned them off for even a minute. Dogs were the only way to go. Me, Thompson. Gurley and Weston loaded the teams and headed from camp to make the pole. Should have been easy going. It wasn't. 2 hours in, saw something in the distance. Looked like a city of ice, all towers and such. It looked like a castle. Warned them that it was a mirage, but Gurley insisted we look. Other 2 backed him up, so we went on. Took an hour and a half to get there. The image flitting in and out like something out of a dream. Finally, reached it. Damned if it wasn't real. Towers all carved from ice and snow, all different shades of black and blue. Beautiful, but terrifying. Something about it just wrong. Dogs were having none of it. Teams started to attack each other. Had to separate them. Decided to explore the structure on foot, cross the bridge over a crack that we couldn't see the bottom of. It must have gone all the way down to hell. You know, like Dante said the seventh circle of the pit was frozen. Huh. He just might have been right. Anyway, made our way inside, like nothing I've ever seen. The whole thing was totally empty. Enormous chamber, ceilings reaching up so high you could barely make them out. Everything carved from solid blocks of ice. Finally, reached what looked like a throne room. Biggest room we'd been to yet. Could have fit a stadium inside. Dais in the center. Steps laid up maybe 30 feet to a foot of the throne. And there was a man there. Well, I think he was a man at any rate. He spoke to us. Well, no, that's not right. He didn't speak. But we knew what he meant, just the same. Knew he could give us whatever we wanted if we asked, and he deigned to grant it. And the others, they started shouting things. Money, fame, woman. You know, just the normal crap. Something held me back. Oh, I wanted to yell, just like they were, but you don't get something for nothing, yeah? Couldn't make it balance. Sure enough, they don't get done falling all over each other, but the thing, like a man, he throws his head back and just starts to laugh. It's an evil thing, you get me? And the ground cracks open, every bit as deep as the abyss we crossed to get to the castle. And there's things there in the dark, moving, squirming, and up they come. And now, they're out into the light, and they're grabbing at Thompson and Gurley and Weston, and they're screaming, yeah? Yeah, the squirming things are ripping them apart, taking chunks of skin and bone, and then they get pulled into the pit, the ground closing behind them. And there I'm left standing, looking at this thing. And I could tell from his expression that he's waiting for me to tell him what I want. And God help me, I want to. But somehow I don't. I back out of that chamber and run back the way I came, his laugh chasing me the whole way. Just as I'm crossing the bridge, I hear him again in my mind. Tells me he's gonna find me. Make me tell him what I want. And I knew he was speaking true. Felt it in my bones. He'll find me, and I'll tell him I know it. And then those squirming things are gonna drag me into the dark too. Irresistible as a glacier. He's gonna come. Just a matter of time. White House's story is remarkable, if hardly believable even for a yellow journalist like myself. But something about it has wormed its way into my psyche and lodged there like a popcorn kernel jammed in my teeth. Sent me pouring through Oleg's collection, just to see if I could find anything that could give remote credence to his ravings. And I have. There's nothing particular about the story that makes it stand out. It's just a fable, a fairy tale, really. The same as hundreds like it. Except for now, in the context of a madman's story, it makes a shiver of ice crawl down my spine. I feel the age-worn pages to the beginning for a third time and begin to read. Once upon a time, long before the New Age, there was a place of ice and snow, its ruler strong of arm and wise of mind, but hard in his stewardship of the law, as the frozen land that compromised his kingdom. The king's queen was a fabled beauty, and their love was deep and wide. From the joy of their union, they were blessed with 3 children, twin sons, and a younger daughter who was the joy of the kingdom. As the princess were the elder, tradition demanded that one of them would inherit the mantle of rule from the king upon his death, since the boys were twins, and both equally qualified in talent and temperament. When they came of age, the king sought the advice of the court magician to determine which boy was more suited for the kingship. The mage took the princess into the waste for a full 10 days, calling down most terrible magics to see into their very souls. When they returned from the icy expanse, the magician had an answer for the king. The younger twin was to rule, and the older boy, though happy for his brother, was nevertheless saddened that he had not been chosen. The maid suggested to the king that, in order to soothe this disappointment, the prince be allowed to train in the mystic arts. The king loved all of his children equally, and, hating to see any of them in pain, readily agreed. But the king was deceived. Unbeknownst to him, the magician was a foul trickster who secretly hated the royal family, for what slight only he knew in his hidden heart. Conducting the rite in the waste, he had discovered a kernel of darkness in the elder son, a seed that he devised he would nurture, to the detriment of the king and all of his house. For the next several years, the magician trained the elder twin in magics great and awesome, but also clandestinely in spells dark and forbidden. This last would have remained hidden indefinitely had not the young prince one day thought to follow her brother to his training unobserved. Peering through the keyhole, the girl witnessed the most horrible violation of an abducted maiden, as the magician instructed the prince in the finer points of deadly blood rites. In tears, the princess fled from the place, running directly to her father and confessing what she had seen between sobs. The king could not doubt the report of his daughter, who he knew was as pure and honest as the early morning sun. Though his heart was heavy, he was resolved to what must be done in accordance with the law. The king ordered his guard to detain the magician and the prince, and to prepare stakes upon which to burn the pair for their crimes. The soldiers suffered heavy losses to the mystic's dreadful spells as they assaulted his keep, but ultimately forced their way inside and seized the treacherous wizard and his royal apprentice. In irons, the criminals were driven along the ice-carved roads to the center of the capital, where thick stakes had already been erected upon an enormous pyre of wood and pitch. News of the pending execution had quickly spread, and the king's subjects lined the way to the killing ground, jostling each other to better observe the condemned men. Reaching the pyre, the sorcerer and prince stood bound to their stakes before the king, who asked if they had any final declarations before the sentence was carried out. The magician, at last, revealed his true face, spitting and swearing and attempting to lay a curse upon his hated ruler. The king ordered the executioner remove the man's tongue with a sharp knife, whereas the sorcerer had reacted violently, his eyes now glazed in pain, blood seeping from his wounded mouth. The prince maintained a cold, icy composure, his face a silent mask. Only the boy's eyes betrayed the fiery rage that dwelled within, stoked to terrible heights by the treacherous magician. gazing at his son. The king saw the prince was lost, and without a word of goodbye signaled the executioner to ignite the conflagration. At the touch of the flame, the sorcerer began to scream wordlessly, the stump of his tongue no longer capable of curse or prayer. The prince, however, held his silence as he burned alive, the awful heat of his eyes still locked upon his father's face, matched only by the surrounding blaze. At last, all that remained of the boy was ash and bone. Having watched the entirety of the event, the sorrow at last became too much for the good king, and he fell to the ground with a cry as despair overcame him. His wife and remaining children rushed to his side as the king died of a broken heart next to the still smoking remains of his eldest son. The kingdom entered a period of unparalleled mourning, unaware that its tragedy had only just begun. The magician, who was no fool, had crafted mystical wards to warn him of danger. Sensing the approach of the king's guard and knowing their intent, he had crafted a most powerful incantation upon the prince, a spell of resurrection that left the mage's magical energies significantly depleted and unable to replicate the spell upon himself. He made this choice willingly, knowing that even in death, his revenge would be all the sweeter, having been carried out by one the king loved. And indeed, 1 month after the execution and subsequent death of the king, the prince's remains stirred where they laid interred in an unmarked tomb. Far into the waste, dark energies of an unknown origin wrapped the flame-blackened bones, coalescing and knitting into living flesh until the prince was reformed, whole and unmarked. Besides allowing the prince to cheat death of its due, the spell served a second purpose. That was to transfer the sum total of the magician's arcane knowledge to the boy. Imbued with this dreadful skill, the prince called upon an army of the dead, the frozen ground breaking open into fissures as his dark forces poured loose from hell itself. The prince and his host swept across the land in a wave of horrific slaughter en route to his brother, now seated upon the throne in the capital. Along the way, the army of the dead was further augmented by the living, joined by those kind of low men who seek the will of the cruel and powerful to serve. The young king's forces were no match for this unholy alliance, and were washed aside by the forces of the vengeful prince. Taking the castle with ease, the prince came upon the remains of his family huddled in the throne room. His mother and sister he gave to the low men to serve as spoils of war. Their screams were loud and lasted many days as the prince's living forces satiated their lustful desires before finally, mercifully, ending the woman's misery with a sharp blade. The prince's twin, though, was to suffer perhaps an even worse fate. Forced to bear witness to the horrific torture of his mother and sister, upon their death, he was brought to an audience with his sibling. Calling upon his magics, the prince ripped open another fissure to hell. The dead of his army poured into the throne room, bodily lifting the defeated twin upon their rotting shoulders and surging through the rift, the screaming king borne with them into the pit. The unholy pilgrimage continued, a noxious flood of the dead and damned spilling through the crack until at last all had returned from whence they came. With a rumble, the fissure closed, leaving only the sorcerer prince and the dumbfounded remains of his living army. Ascending to the dais, the prince took his seat upon the throne of his father. "The king is dead," — he intoned. "Long live the king." The population of the kingdom had been ravaged by the advance of the king's army. Fearing the ruler who now held their lives to his whim, the survivors began to leave. First a trickle, and then more steadily until their exodus was almost as torrential as the restoration of the king's dark army to the pit. Soon, too, did the living remnants of the king's army disperse, realizing that the darkness that inhabited the king's soul was too deep even for such evil men as they. It is from those survivors, the subjects, and low men alike, that the tale spread far and away of the Dark King in the north. He controls the dead, they whisper in taverns and inns when the night has fallen and the moon shines high and full. He's king of the spooks. King of the spooks, they call him. KingSpook. They say he sits there upon a seat of ice, steeped in shadows darker than the blackest night, kept alive by his unholy power. Some seek him, believing his magic can grant their deepest desires. Others warn caution, claiming it can indeed, but only at the cost of your very soul. So, travel north, if you dare, to the land of ice and snow. There you may find the KingSpook, sat upon the throne of his father. If your need be so great, perhaps your soul may be cheap enough payment. Perhaps. I sit back from the table as I close the book, fingers rubbing at the bridge of my nose. A fairy tale, a fable. And yet, as twilight sets in and the shadows begin to lengthen through the library windows, I'm left to wonder on the tale of a madman, ice and horror. Dark things are coming, and this KingSpook, I'm terribly afraid he might be one of them. Those eyes, those horrible, staring eyes. It took me a moment to regain composure and spin around to await the fate of my life. As I turn, a piercing, tearing sensation fills the back of my neck, and I cannot scream. I cannot move. I'm helpless, staring blankly with an expressionless face, and in an instant, the blade is twisted. I writhe in agony, and then simply, I wake up. A new life, a new surrounding, new attire, and a single candle dimly glowing and providing just enough light to see the claustrophobic pit of jagged rocks and stalactites that hang over me close enough that I could feel their sharp points scraping into the crown of my skull. I turn around slowly, making sure to stay low, and I'm presented by a solid cave wall. The candle, now burning shorter and shorter due to the lack of oxygen, is then blown out by a gush of wind from a small crack in the roof of the cave. And there, for what feels like hours, I am left once again, staring blankly with nothing but my confusing thoughts of my dreams. Am I dreaming still? A new dream? My confusion is shattered by the discovery of another flat wall as I slide my hand eagerly along the pitch-black cave wall. I am trapped. As the oxygen gets slowly replaced by frantic breaths, the small, jagged room slowly begins to feel like a sauna. A few minutes later, an oven. A few seconds after that, my eyes begin to dim. I am motionless once again, writhing in pain. I could feel my flesh bubbling all over as I take a last breath of what feels like steam being pumped down my lungs, scorching its way down. And the eyes, despite my blinded, agonized eyes, I can see them again, staring back at me for a split second. They freeze me, and again, I wake up. A new surrounding, a new life, a new agonizing death. And this process repeats over and over and over again. Every time I wake up, I'm a new person in a new time zone. Endless, painful deaths for what feels like an eternity. I only ever stay alive for a couple of minutes. Sometimes seconds. And every now and then, a few days. But what is certain is that I die. I've died in wars all over the world. I've died of famine, dysentery, fire, blades, bullets, endless pitfalls, suffocation, drowning, and any death you could imagine. And the last thing I see before I die is the eyes. I simply, possibly cannot describe the eyes, even if I can call them that. They just always seem to be there just as I die, as a sort of reminder of who is doing this. They stare at me. Black, glassy eyes. No pupils, no movement. They seem to reflect everything back at me, through me. I wake up once again, and this time, I'm in a forest, alone, as always. My movements seem to have led me towards my goals. Like a puppet, I'm only partially aware of what my body is doing. With all my will and strength, I try, despite the force of locking sensation in my joints, to run the opposite direction. I feel trapped, as if I'm tied to a bungee cord that's pulling me the other way. And then, with a loud snap, I am flung forwards. Have I escaped? And I take no time to think of an answer. Straight away, I head to a cave on the other side of the forest. Yes, another cave. After having died in one a few thousand times, I've come to prefer to suffocate than to be ripped to shreds by the wild beasts that roam the forest. Let's just say, it's not as peaceful of a death as suffocation. And yes, it's still agonizing. But after doing this for what feels like an eternity, you develop preferences. It's the same for everything, except all I have is death. I peer into the cave. It doesn't seem to lead anywhere. It's more like a giant ice cream scoop tore a chunk out of the hill. I lay there for a few moments staring outwards. It's rather odd if you think about it. This one time I died by a stampede of elephants. I would say about 300 deaths ago. And I laughed to myself. Mind the shoes. I just got them cleaned. And then my skull was crushed into a mushy pulp. The last thing I saw, just before the eyes, of course, were chunky bits of flesh, which I can only assume was my own brain dotted around the floor. Blood covered every inch of the area which I was standing in, except for one thing, a pair of bright white shoes with mangled legs still attached. Have you ever been to space? I was once an astronaut doing repairs on a space station a couple of 1,000 deaths ago. A fault in my helmet released oxygen, and the tube connecting the oxygen to my valve dislodged. The air was sucked out in an instant. Space was beautiful, just so beautiful. That was before the glass on my helmet was covered with the intestines and lungs that I had just thrown up. I giggled to myself silently before popping my leg up on a rock in the cave. I've only ever died in space once. And then it hit me. My eyes spread as if my eyelids were being yanked open. An article pops into my head. It's a news article I had read about the death of an astronaut. He died the same way as me. Could it possibly be? Am I destined to be the one to endure every single person's death who has ever lived? And then I just scream in the loudest voice possible, why? I sit up, staring into the forest, and then I freeze. A voice rattles in my ear and screeches. Because every time I've looked at you throughout eternity, you have never once said, "Forgive me." I freeze for a couple of seconds, and then I wake once again. Every time I die, I am completely alone. The eyes which were once haunting the very essence of my soul have vanished, and I am left with nothing but death. The summer of 1986 was, for the most part, pretty typical. I was 10 years old at the time, so we were doing the things 10-year-old boys love to do, like swimming, riding around on our bikes, and playing Little League games. The area I grew up in was very rural, populated mostly by farmers and their kids. The nearest town was Doghouse, with a population of under 100. And while it didn't offer much for kids to do, we usually didn't have a hard time making our own fun. One Friday, me and my friends Kevin, Mike, and Scott decided to walk the train tracks that went out of town. Already familiar with what was down the tracks to the east, we decided to explore the western stretch. The tracks leading west out of town were far more raw, as they cut through a tree-lined valley that extended for miles, with the trees forming a canopy that made it feel more like a tunnel than a path. About 2 miles down the tracks, we came across an old, run-down house about 100 feet from the tracks. There were no apparent roads leading to it, which led us think it was probably just an old abandoned farmhouse. The house was badly in need of maintenance, with flaking paint and broken boards on the porch. However, there was a strong feeling that someone still lived there and was probably not at home when we stumbled across it. We entered the house, and it was as run down on the inside as it was on the outside. The furniture was very old, with rips and scratches, The air had the faint smell of smoke. Not like cigarettes or cigars, but more like a fireplace, though I didn't see a fireplace or a fire-burning stove inside. The wallpaper was faded and peeling away from the plaster walls. Lots of knickknacks were on display on shelves and curio cabinets. Being the mischievous boys that we were, Scott grabbed the vase from a shelf and smashed it on the floor. Nervous laughter erupted, followed by a brief pause before Mike and Kevin joined in on the juvenile vandalism. I'm stunned to see how freely my friends were destroying this stuff, so I panicked and ran from the house, thinking that somebody lives there or owns that stuff, and I didn't want to get into trouble. An hour later, I've arrived at home. Saturday morning. I woke up and enjoyed cartoons and cereal like I did every Saturday morning. However, I couldn't shake the guilt of what my friends did to that house. After lunch, I reluctantly made my way back to the house and knocked on the door. A few moments passed before I saw an old woman come to the door. "Hello there, young man. Can I help you?" I replied, yes, ma'am. Me and my friends were here last night, and they broke some of your things. I wanted to apologize." The old woman replied, "Yes, I know. I caught the other 3 boys in the act. Anyway, it's really not that important. It shows a lot of character that you came back to apologize. My name is Maggie. Would you like to come in and visit for a few minutes?" I agreed and entered the house again. From what I could tell, the house had been cleaned up following our rampage. I even noticed the vase that Scott smashed, sitting back where I'd seen it the night before. She must have had another one stashed away somewhere. We sat in the living room and she asked me typical questions like my name and my interest and, stuff like that. A few minutes of banal pleasantries passed before she paused and said, "Now, where are my manners? Would you like some milk and cookies?" Naturally, I took her up on the offer. As she left to go to the kitchen, I realized that I had completely forgotten about my baseball game later that afternoon. Bolting from the chair, I tell the woman, "I'm sorry, but I forgot to have a baseball game this afternoon and I'm going to be late. I'll come back another day." Before she can protest, I'm already out the door and heading back home. Again, I found myself running away from the house for the second time in 2 days. I made it home just in time to leave for the baseball game, but we had to forfeit since my friends didn't show up. They must have been grounded after getting caught by Maggie, and she tattled to their parents about the vandalism. After spending more time thinking about how I left the day before, I started to feel guilty for leaving the old woman so abruptly, so I decided to unburden myself to my dad. I explained what we had done and how I'd gone back to apologize. My dad looks at me with an unconvincing smirk. "Sure you did. You were in Crazy Maggie's house. Except that about 40 years ago an angry mob barricaded her in that house, then burnt it to the ground after the bodies of 7 missing children were found, buried on her property." My eyes opened wide in a combination of fear and disbelief. Perhaps my dad is just messing with me, but I still pled with him for about 20 minutes that I was telling the truth. Frustrated with my tenacity, Dad said, "You could still see the graves where each body was discovered. Let's go. I'll show you, boy." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we arrived at the house an hour later. To my surprise, it's exactly as my dad said. The house was no longer there. Only the foundation and the burned and rotting frame remained. Did I imagine the whole thing? My dad told me about the history of the house and the tragic story of the grisly murders. He beckons me back behind the house to point out where the bodies were discovered. We round the corner, and he spends a few moments to inspect the area more closely. "Huh, that's odd," my dad said. "I thought there were only 7 murders, but I count 10 graves here." So, I live in the middle of nowhere, far away from the rest of my friends. I have to wake up very early in the morning to catch my bus, and I usually eat my breakfast as it's bringing me to school. I don't have any brothers or sisters, there's just me, the Ziggy the cat, and my dad. And then there's Martha, the chronically pissed off woman who insists that I call her my mother. But lately I don't feel so inclined to do so. She's hardly ever around because it seems like she works every day of the goddamn week. As soon as she comes home, the first thing she does is find a reason to start yelling at me or cry about something. No rational human being hates their job that much, and no one is forcing her to continue working there. There's the paycheck, I guess. But no amount of pay seems to be worth sacrificing the respect of your family. Whenever she's not home, it's quiet and peaceful. Whenever she's home, she's a fucking mess. When she's not screaming at me over some menial task that I didn't do or didn't do right, she's crying about it. Any other person might feel bad about this, but it's such a frequent thing that I become almost completely desensitized to it. And when she does have a day off, oh boy, I run for the hills. I just cannot deal with her bullshit for an entire day. Martha may be the woman that gave birth to me, but by her behavior toward her own family alone, she's hardly a mother figure in my life. I'm 15 years old and I get good grades. I don't cut class. I don't do drugs. And I never really cared for violent video games all that much. Shit, I don't even have a girlfriend. Okay, to be completely honest, there is a reason for that though. One that might be, shall I say, uncomfortable for her to hear from her only son. But if she's always coming home so upset and pissed off over nothing, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to consider coming out to her. Martha is never happy, and I'm starting to think that something might actually be very seriously wrong with her. My dad doesn't want to talk about it with me. He insists that she takes medication for her issues and that it's under control. Is she getting paid to scream and sob like a crazy person? Because that's all I ever see her do. I literally cannot remember the last time she smiled at me. The day she took that job, her personality did a total 180, and the woman who was my mother vanished. Even poor Ziggy has taken avoiding to her when she caught. Even poor Ziggy has taken to avoiding her when he hears her car pull into the driveway. Maybe cats really do have a sixth sense. One week, she left on a business trip to Australia. That was easily the quietest, most peaceful week I've ever had in recent years. Ziggy had full reign of the house, strutting about in his fluffy glory like he owned the place. Dad and I went to a local motorcycle show in town. So many amazing bikes, and shiny leather clothes too. On the way home from the rally, I told my dad. I told him about, well, myself. He took it better than I thought he would. A few of the other gay kids at my school weren't so lucky. I'm very glad to have a father that gets it, but not long after I broke the news to him, his proud smile quickly sank. His facial features seemed to hang limp off his face like a half-molten rubber. "Oh, boy," he sighed. "Your mother... Martha will learn to live with it," I barked. I want this part of the conversation to end before it has a chance to fucking begin. And if she has a problem with it, she could stay in Melbourne for all I care. She works so hard for your benefit, you know. You're still her son. She loves you. And a fine job she's done of showing it, Dad. How much longer are you gonna keep making excuses for her being a shitty parent and a shitty human being? I looked over and saw my father's mouth crack open for a moment, as though he was about to reply, but he didn't. The rest of that drive home was awkward as hell for the both of us. When the day came that she was supposed to come home from Australia, she was several hours late. Dad agreed not to give her any details about our previous conversation. He insisted that I be brave enough to tell her myself. He said that the hardest thing any man can do is be completely honest with himself. And I can certainly appreciate him trying to be encouraging and supportive. I just wasn't feeling up to it. My life of leisure is about to come to a grinding halt as soon as she gets off that plane, and, sure enough, it finally pulls up to the gate within 10 minutes of it landing. The arrival door is finally opened, and just as my heart accelerates in preparation for the verbal ass-kicking I had been quietly dreading for the last week, then there's Martha, warmly smiling at the sight of me. Am I dreaming? Did someone slip drugs into my coffee or something? Or am I just seeing a happy-go-lucky Australian tourist that just so happens to be my mother's build and facial features? She actually ran to give me a hug. I almost didn't want to accept it, as it seemed too good to be true. In a way, it still does. On the way home, Martha treated us all to dinner at some highfalutin gourmet burger joint on the other side of town. "Those crazy Aussies, man," she crowed, digging into the rarest chunk of ground beef I've ever seen leave a restaurant kitchen. They love their meat pies and beer, but don't know how to make a decent burger if it meant saving their own lives. I didn't respond to her. I had no idea how to. I ate mine quickly and didn't say a word for the rest of the meal. When we all got home, Ziggy took one whiff of her presence and bolted for my bedroom like his tail was on fire. Martha seemed dismayed by this, as if she wanted to play with that poor cat like she hadn't bothered to in several months. I looked up at my dad. He must have seen the worry in my face, but there wasn't much he could do about it. This person must either be a complete stranger or something very interesting happened in Australia. Several days passed, and it was the same thing. Instead of the usual screaming and crying about my faults and failures, Martha always looked elated to see me. She asked about Ziggy's whereabouts a lot too. I had this awful notion that if I told her that he'd been camping under my bed ever since she got home, too afraid to come out from underneath it, that something bad would happen. I know it sounds ridiculous, as much of a bitch as she could be or had been. She'd never had laid a finger on that animal. The most I had ever seen her do was shoo him off the table so she could drop a pile of work papers onto it. Then, one day, I came home from school to find that all the laundry on my floor had been picked up. I've been washing my own clothes since I was 12. What the fuck is going on here? I ran toward my bed to check on Ziggy, but he was gone. His food and water were still full. I went down to the living room to look around for him, but there wasn't a trace to be found. I found Martha milling about and humming to herself, facing the opposite side of the room. "Marth?" I stopped myself, took a hard breath, and tried again. "Mother? Have you seen Ziggy?" She perked her head around and looked at me very slowly. Her eyes grew wide like dinner plates, and a sickeningly thin smile spread across her face. She took a few hobbling steps toward me, and my stomach tightened. And then she stopped in her tracks. "Dear," she spoke, Her voice vibrated in a saccharine sweet resonance I don't think I've heard since I was little. "You didn't need to keep a secret like that from me." Her head cocked to one side, much the same way as a curious little parrot, only not at all cute like one. "You understand?" How did she know about that? Dad promised that he would leave that conversation up to me. I stormed out, back up to my bedroom. I'd have locked the door, but I guess I was kinda hoping that Ziggy would eventually come skulking back to his hiding place. A few more days passed, and he never came back at all. I posted flyers all over town, but no one had spotted him. I spent the next week either staying after school intentionally or hiding in my room, anything to avoid having to speak to Martha, or, for all I knew, this stranger pretending to be Martha. I never in 1,000 years thought that I'd miss the borderline psychotic bitch that used to come home every day and whine for several hours. At least that would have been a sign that everything was normal. Her office called the house. Dad answered it. She missed several days of work without so much as an email or phone call. They were pretty pissed about it, too. Ordinarily, I'd say that it was probably for the best, as the usual Martha that I had been so used to would no longer have any reason to be such a bitch. But nothing seemed to change. She seemed as bubbly as a fat drag queen, always seemed so happy to see me and never hesitated to let me know about it. I started shirking my household chores, seeing if I could piss her off intentionally. She barely seemed to notice. She just cracked that hair-thin smile at me that would make my skin crawl. This continued for another week. The round of bills came due, and Dad was left to wrestle with them while dodging a few collectors. One night, I accidentally answered a phone call meant for my dad. He urged me to stay off the phone as he didn't want to bother with creditors calling for him. But it wasn't a creditor who called. The man on the other line had a thick, whiny-sounding accent. He said he was calling from Melbourne, Australia. He also said that it was urgent that he be put in touch with my father right away. "Is your father there with you?" he insisted. "I'm with the Melbourne Metropolitan Police. This is regarding your mother's stay here a few weeks ago. Can you put him on, please?" "Yes, he is. Just a sec." I turned around and looked at him. At first, he shook his head, but when I told him where the call was coming from, he raised an eyebrow and grabbed the phone. I went upstairs to my room, contemplating how wrong everything seemed to be going. Martha, the woman whom for the last few years only ever paid attention to me when she was angry with me, seemed to be walking on sunshine ever since she got off that plane. I doubt that she had scored any kind of promotion at her job. As if that were the case, she would have at least bothered to show up for work when she got back to the US. What was going on with this woman? My thoughts were broken by the sound of footsteps rushing up the stairs. I felt my entire abdomen seize with panic as my door flew open. It was my father. "Pack a bag right now." His face was gray and rigid like concrete, but I didn't question him. I stuffed damn near everything I could reach into my school bag, tried to fit a few extra things as well, then made my way downstairs to see my father greeting me. He had one finger over his lips. Obviously, he wanted me to be quiet from here on out. I could only mouth out the words, "Dad, what is it?" But he only shook his head and motioned me toward the garage. We crept past the porch door, and then there's Martha, perfectly motionless, staring up at the rising moon. Quietly closing the door behind us, Dad insisted that I get into the car. As soon as the garage was open enough to do so, Dad hit the gas and we took off into the darkness of the night. "Dad," I cried, "Ziggy could be around some—" "Ziggy's dead," he snapped back, a slight wobble in his voice. I found what was left of him in the backyard yesterday." I swear, I felt my heart stop. My little furry friend gone. Terrible sadness overtook me. But what does this have to do with us taking off in such a hurry? What about... That's not your mother. Now, there were tears in my father's eyes. The Melbourne police found her body about an hour ago.
I always loved camping. It has always been one of those things that I fell in love with as a kid. My dad and I used to go camping all the time when I was young. He would always tease me about the creatures that could come up to our tents. Wolves, bears, or monsters. He would often scare me with a monster mask he would bring with him. Stand outside the tent and pretend to be a monster just to spook me. It always worked. I went out camping last week. It's been 6 years since my dad died. I decided to go on my own to enjoy it, to relax, and to try to remember the good times I used to have with my father. I miss those fun times. I met a kind couple who was camped not too far away. They seemed so happy that I was almost jealous. The day went by just fine. It wasn't until that night that something went wrong. I woke up with a jerk. I could hear heavy breathing and footsteps around my tent. My heart raced, and I didn't know why. I was disoriented. I didn't know where I was at first, having almost forgotten that I had gone camping. And then I laughed, telling Dad to stop, but Dad was gone. He had been gone several years. That thing outside my tent was not my dad. I felt a strong fear build up inside me as the snaps of twigs echoed in the emptiness of the night. I heard no crickets, no wind, nothing, but the thick, heavy breathing that circled around my tent. A shadow cast upon my tent, the fire outside still barely burning. It was stretched, disoriented, but long jaws like a wolf could be seen with teeth that seemed out of place, crooked, and the thick slides of drool were caught in the shadow as it dropped. It had to be a wolf, or a bear, I couldn't tell. Dad always joked. I never thought it would actually happen. A deep snarl came from the beast outside. I was so scared, I couldn't scream. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but no signal. The beast outside began to rub against my tent. A cracked snarl as it breathed deeply. It could smell me. I knew it. I don't know how, but I knew it was there for me. It was going to kill me. The tent began to get pushed in, the creature outside clawing and pawing at it. Then, suddenly, it launched itself forward, smashing the tent in as it snarled and cracked an eerie howl, like a wolf in the night, but wrong. This howl sounded man-made, in a way. I could not scream. My tent now halfway caved in as the beast tried to find me. It would know where I was if I screamed. A heavy paw ripped through the tent. I had to cover my mouth with my hands as tears welled up in my eyes. I thought I was going to die. I thought at first the bear paw, but its fur was missing, claws nearly 3 inches long, a toe broken and hanging off as if dead flesh and stitches. I saw stitches going around the beast's ankle, as if a human had helped it. I watched as the paw pulled out, and a wolf-like muzzle shoved its way into the hole, trying to get its head in. Those crooked teeth pointed outwards, a second set inside its muzzle like a shark ready to rip apart flesh. Stitches going across furless flesh as it snarled and growled, trying to rip into the tent more. Then, a voice. I felt my heart stop. Come out. Play with me. Love me. I thought I had imagined it, but it kept talking in an inhuman, cracked voice, like what you would hear in a distorted recording. But this beast's mouth was moving with every word. It spoke so fast, it's hard to remember it all, but I remember it kept repeating, "Love me." It demanded that I leave the tent and love it. I'll make you a part of me. We'll never be alone, always together, forever, in my flesh. I heard a scream outside my tent. A woman. I saw the light of a flashlight cross over the tent walls that hadn't caved in. An unearthly roar, the same human-created distorted noise. It was so loud, right over me. But then, it left. It got off of my tent. "Love me!" I heard it scream in the voice as it ran. I could only assume it was chasing the woman. I could hear her screaming, "Get off!" Blood-curdling screams of sheer horror as she cried. I was so scared, I could not move. Morning came. I could not sleep that night. I heard a man outside my tent calling to see if I was inside. It was a man dressed in a uniform. I guess he was the forest ranger that watched over the camping section. I slowly got out with his help. The couple that had been not too far from me. Their tent ripped to shreds, an area marked off by police. The man told me a murder had happened. I asked the stranger, what happened to the man who was with her? He gave me an odd look before asking, "What man?" She had apparently come alone, and I knew that wasn't right. I talked to them, and she seemed so happy. He helped me get my stuff into my car, and I packed up to leave and thanked him. As I closed my door, I heard him knocking on the window. I rolled it down, and fear struck into me as he stared at me with black eyes, red, inhuman pupils in the center, and tipped his hat. Those stitches around his wrist. "You'll love me next time. You will never want to leave." I slammed on the gas pedal, looking in my side mirror as I drove away, a creepy smile on his face as he just watched. I've never gone back, and I'm so afraid of going camping now. When I tell the story to anyone else, they just tell me it must have been a bear, and I was just scared. But that was not a bear. I don't know what it was, but it talked to me. It wants me to love it. And I almost want to love him back. We could be together forever.
It was a car accident. Nothing particularly remarkable, but fatal nonetheless. You left behind a wife and 2 children. It was a painless death. The EMTs tried their best to save you, but to no avail. Your body was so utterly shattered, you were better off. Trust me. And that's when you met me.
What? What happened? Where am I?
You died, I said, matter-of-factly. No point mincing words.
There was a truck and it was skidding.
Yep.
I died?
Yep. But don't feel bad about it. Everyone dies. You looked around. There was nothingness. Just you and me.
What is this place? Is this the afterlife?
More or less.
Are you a god?
Yep, I'm God.
My kids, my wife,
What about them?
will they be alright?
Ah, that's what I like to see. You just died, and your main concern is for your family. That's good stuff right there. You looked at me with fascination. To you, I didn't look like God. I just looked like some man, some vague authority figure. More of a grammar school teacher than the Almighty. Don't worry. They'll be fine. Your kids will remember you as perfect in every way. They didn't have time to grow contempt for you. Your wife will cry on the outside, but will secretly be relieved. To be fair, your marriage was falling apart. If it's any consolation, she'll feel very guilty for feeling relieved.
Oh. So what happens now? Do I go to heaven or hell or something?
Neither. You'll be reincarnated.
Ah. So the Hindus were right.
All the religions are right in their own way. Come, walk with me. You followed along as we strolled in the void.
Where are we going?
Nowhere in particular. It's just nice to walk while we talk.
So, what's the point then? When I get reborn, it'll just be a blank slate, right? A baby. So all my experiences and everything I did in my life won't matter.
Not so. You have within you all the knowledge and experiences of your past lives. You just don't remember them right now. I stopped walking and took you by the shoulders. Your soul is more magnificent, beautiful, and gigantic than you can possibly ever imagine. A human mind can only contain a tiny fraction of what you are. It's like sticking your finger in a glass of water to see if it's hot or cold. You put a tiny part of yourself into the vessel, and when you bring it back out, you've gained all the experiences it had. You've been a human for the last 34 years, so you haven't stretched out yet and felt the rest of your immense consciousness. If we hung out here for longer, you'd start remembering everything. But there's no point doing that between each life.
How many times have I been reincarnated then?
Oh, lots and lots, and into lots of different lives. This time around, you'll be a Chinese peasant girl in 540 AD.
Wait, what? You're sending me back in time.
Well, I guess technically, time as you know it only exists in your universe. Things are different where I come from.
Where did you come from?
Oh, sure. I come from somewhere else. And there are others like me. I know you'll want to know what it's like there, but you honestly won't understand.
Oh. But wait. If I get reincarnated at other places in time, could I have interacted with myself at some point?
Sure. Happens all the time. And with both lives only aware of their own time span, you don't even know it's happening.
So what's the point of it all?
Seriously? You're asking me for the meaning of life? Isn't that a little stereotypical?
Well, it is a reasonable question.
The meaning of life, the reason I made this whole universe, is for you to mature.
You mean mankind. You want us to mature.
No, just you. I made this whole universe for you. With each new life, you grow and mature and become a larger and greater intellect.
Just me? What about everyone else?
There is no one else. In this universe, there's just you and me.
But all the people on Earth.
All you. Different incarnations of you.
Wait, I'm everyone?
Now you're getting it.
I'm every human who's ever lived.
Or who will ever live, yes.
I'm Abraham Lincoln.
And you're John Wilkes Booth, too.
I'm Hitler.
And you're the millions he killed.
I'm Jesus?
And you're everyone who followed him. Every time you victimized someone, you were victimizing yourself. Every act of kindness you've done to yourself. Every happy and sad moment ever experienced by any human was, or will be, experienced by you.
Why? Why do you do all of this?
Because someday you will become like me, because that's what you are. You're one of my kind. You're my child.
Whoa. You mean I'm a god?
No, not yet. You're a fetus. You're still growing. Once you lived every human life throughout all time, you will have grown enough to be born.
So the whole universe, it's just...
an egg of sorts. Now it's time for you to move on to your next life. And with that, I sent you on your way.